Hi everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to draw water in graphite. Now the tips and techniques that I'm going to share in this video can be applied for any water, so whether or not it's waves or more of a calmer surface, the same would apply. It's all about focusing on the contrast and the layering process. Now the very first layer I like to use graphite powder just to purely map in my main lights and darks. Now I do this if I'm drawing fur or feathers, the same principle is exactly the same. Once I've hinted at that and I've got that softness with the graphite powder, I can come in with my graphite pencils and refine everything. Now even at this stage here, I'm using a paper blending stump to soften the layers of graphite. I don't want to be indicating at too many harsh details at this stage. Now once I've built up an initial soft layer, that's when I can start to hint at more of those details that are more in focus. So we're starting to work with the water that's almost lower down, closer to the deeper sections of the water underneath the surface. And then as we build up our layers, that's hinting for those ripples that are on top of the water, on top of that surface. Now my biggest tip when drawing water to make that look realistic is you must make sure that you achieve good contrast. So you want to have your darks really dark and your highlights nice and bright. Now if you've got a really bright reflection on the water, you can leave the white of the paper showing. But for this, because the swan was casting a shadow on that water, this lower section was all pretty dark. So I'm using my different pencils here to achieve those variation in values and allowing the lighter graphite powder to still show through on some of those lighter midtones. Now if I do need to add more highlights here, I can do that at later stages because I've made sure to apply the graphite in the correct way. Now this is something that I'll continue to talk about when we come back in adding highlights. But as I continue to work on the next section of the water, you can really see here how I'm already hinting at the ripples on the surface. So how I apply that graphite in terms of where the lights and the darks are, we're already hinting at that movement. Now because the swan is sort of midway through flapping its wings, that's going to be causing a lot of disturbance directly underneath the swan, especially where the legs are. So this is something that I want to make sure that I capture. Now when I start to work with my erasers here, I'm using a Tombow mono eraser to pull in some of those finer lines. That's going to help to build up more of that movement. Now that high contrast again is something that I do want to make sure that I get right, because without it this water is going to look very, very flat. Now when we work in with the disturbance in that water, like the section here, this is where everything can start to get quite confusing. Where the lights and the darks almost overlap, they create some very unique shapes. But the easiest way to draw this realistically is just to focus on the shapes that you see. So don't picture this as drawing water, because quite often our brain will go, oh, I know what water looks like, I'm just going to start to move my pencil like this. And before we know it, it doesn't really resemble that reference photo. But if we start to look at that photo for the 1 square inch that we're looking at there, again, breaking it up in small sections can really help here, then we'll start to focus just primarily on the values and the shapes. When we then sit back in our chair, have a look at more of a distance, that's when it looks more realistic. We've not allowed ourselves to get overwhelmed by the process because we've managed to break it up in a little bit more of a structured way. Now one of the other things to bear in mind is at those earlier stages, it doesn't really look like water. Not until you start adding in your highlights and refining the contrast further. So as I come in here with more of my darker graphite and my erasers, this is where I'm starting to add more of that depth. Now the layering process is what helps to maximise the depth. We can't achieve the depth and therefore realism in a piece if we're only working with 1 or 2 layers. When I come back in here and just dab slightly with the putty eraser like I've just done a minute ago, that there to me is an extra layer. I'm not adding graphite, I'm taking it away, but it's an extra layer that I've done to maximise the depth within that section. So everything here, it might be a combination of 10 to 15 layers. But it's all about maximising the contrast through the layering process to enhance the depth. Now as again I work on this side, exactly the same process. I'm going to apply the graphite powder, hint at my main lights and darks, and then I'm going to continue to refine that with my pencils. Now the one thing you'll notice here is I don't ever jump into my darkest pencils first. So here I'm starting off with maybe like a HB, but I want to be building up my layers as I go, gradually darkening them with each stage. I don't want to jump into something like a 9B and get that contrast sharp right from the beginning because I'm going to lack depth. I need to be building up my values in stages. Now when we draw water, we sometimes sit there and think, I have no idea where to start, and right away we end up starting to feel overwhelmed. Now, the one thing that I like to do in the real-time tutorial, I really break up the layering process and focus just on one layer at a time, and then breaking it up into the smaller sections. But I want to be making sure here that I'm never thinking of it as anything different to any other element I would tackle. So when we draw fur or feathers, we work with layers, we build up the contrast, we're working on the depth. It's exactly the same here, but the only variation is how we use that pencil. So I always mention about the importance of fur direction, and here it's just the movement of the water, so the direction of the ripples. You can see here where I'm starting to slope those pencil strokes down and then they go back up towards the top. That there is hinting at where that movement, that ripple on the surface, it dips and then curves over. So it's exactly the same if you were drawing fur, where let's say you're changing the fur direction over a cheekbone or the eye socket. It's exactly the same, but we just need to be thinking about what we're doing with that pencil in relation to where that water is moving. So at this stage here, I want to be reinforcing more of the contrast by pulling in more of my highlights. I'm using a Tombow mono eraser here, and as you can see, it's doing a very good job at lifting that graphite off the surface. Now, one of the questions that I'm asked fairly frequently is, why does a Tombow mono eraser not work very well? It has a real hard time lifting that graphite. But as you can see here, it is a good eraser, it does work. But the biggest thing regarding that with any eraser is that the graphite has to be applied in the right way first. If we burnish and we put too much pressure on the pencil and flatten the tooth of the paper, then that eraser is going to have a much harder time lifting that graphite off the surface. In some cases, you might not be able to lift it at all. So you really don't want to burnish. Now, burnishing is just where you use too much pressure and you do flatten the tooth of the paper. You want to make sure that you're using light pressure and carry on working with that contrast. Don't be shy with it. You can see here that I'm using more than enough graphite, but as long as you're using that right layering process and the right technique when applying it, you're able to use your erasers and pull in as many bright highlights as needed towards your last layers. And if you want to allow that white of the paper to show through, then by all means you can do, but quite often highlights don't need to be that bright. Now, the reason that this is my preference by applying graphite and then using my erasers on top to add my highlights is because when I look at my reference photos, no matter if it's fur, feathers, water, whatever it may be, I'm always imagining that those highlights are sitting on the very top. So I want to be making sure that I've got the graphite in first and then I add my highlights after. I just feel like for me, I'm able to then capture it as closely as I can based on what that reference photo is telling me. The highlights, they're not underneath those shadows, so if you were to add the white of the paper there, leave that free and then add your graphite, I feel it just makes sense to go back in and add your highlights over the top. So if you do want the white of the paper to show through so that you know then you've got that really, really bright, then that's okay, but I would still recommend to go back in with your erasers on top just to make sure that those highlights do look like they're sitting above all of those layers of graphite. And it's also about mixing the layers. So you can see here that I'm using that Tombow mono eraser and then I'm back in with my graphite pencils. I'll then darken something up and then I'll come in with more of my erasers and add more highlights. It's all about varying it depending on how bright that highlight should be, how dark a shadow should be. And now with this mechanical pencil where I'm reinforcing those even darker layers, coming in with my erasers, look at that high contrast. This is what starts to make that water look more shinier, more of that wetter appearance. If I don't have dark shadows and bright highlights, it's just not going to look realistic. You're not going to achieve that look of water. Now, when I got to this stage, I felt like I needed to add a little bit more water towards the back of the bird so that I could help balance out the composition a little more. So here I'm just using my graphite powder and a putty eraser to create that faded effect so it goes into the white of the paper. And a big tip when you are looking to create something that fades out into the white of the paper, if you can use your graphite powder, that's going to give you more of that softness. If you try to do that with your graphite pencils, you're going to want to work with more of those smaller circular shading movements so that you avoid those harsher details. Those pencil strokes that are going to have more rigidity to it, more of that in-focus appearance, that's going to pull your attention to an area of the portrait that you don't want. If this area here was too harsh, then it's going to completely distract from the face, the wing, and the main subject. So it is something to pay very close attention to. So it's at this stage where it's pretty much done, but I wanted to sit back in my chair, zoom out of the camera and have a look at more of a distance at what I want to change to make my artwork better. So here I'm just starting to lighten a little bit more of the water, and I'm going to start to tweak some of the values in the feathers to help make those look a little bit more three-dimensional. I really like the softness. This wing was slightly out of focus, but I did want to enhance more of those darker tones just to pull in more definition in some of those areas. So I really do hope that this video has been useful. If it was, I'd really appreciate it if you could give it a like and a thumbs up, because it makes a huge difference to my channel. I also upload a couple of videos to YouTube every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. If you've got any art related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments below, because I'm more than happy to help if I can. And if you are interested in drawing along to this Swan tutorial or any of my other real-time step-by-step lessons, then I'll link all of that in the description below. And I'm going to be uploading another video at the end of the week, but as always, thank you so much for watching.